The warp was never meant for human eyes, and yet its reflection stains every soul that dares to dream. It isn't a place, nor a realm, nor even a direction one can chart on a star map. It is emotions sculpted into eternity, a churning ocean of thought and hunger, where nightmares are born fully grown. To glimpse it is to feel every fear you've ever buried claw its way back to the surface, wearing your own face, whispering in your own voice, promising that suffering is the only truth that matters. In the Imperium, they teach that hell is punishment, but in the warp, hell is simply nature, and all of us are prey drifting toward its open jaws. Before we descend into that fathomless storm, remember to like, share, and subscribe. It keeps our signal alive, even when the void tries to swallow it whole. The first signs were never loud. They didn't arrive with shrieking daemons or rivers of blood or flaming runes carved across the void. They came gently, almost politely, as if the warp enjoyed mocking us through its subtlety. I remember the faint shudder in the deck plating beneath my boots as our ship, the glory of Alecto, approached the narrow corridor of immaterial space that the navigator assured us was stable. That word stable lost all meaning out there. Even as he said it, his third eye remained sealed behind layers of gold filigree and binding script, like he was afraid of what it would show him if he opened it too soon. The air tasted metallic, the way it does before a storm breaks planetside, only this one wasn't born of clouds, but of souls. Most voidsmen learn early not to speak of the strange sensations that come before entry into the Imperium. They claim it invites attention, that the warp listens for its own name, but I've always wondered if that silence is less superstition and more a desperate attempt to cling to sanity, because the moment you acknowledge the shadows, they lean closer. On that day, as I stood beside a humming conduit line, I swear the darkness in the corners of the engine deck shifted just slightly, just enough to make me question whether the shadows had grown longer or my eyesight had grown worse. Someone nearby muttered a prayer under their breath, one of those half-remembered litanies that spread between crewmen like rumors. It didn't matter if the words made sense. In the face of the warp, any sound that wasn't your own heartbeat felt like salvation. Hours before translation, our navigator, Master Hestian, limped from his sanctum, leaning heavily on a staff wrapped with thin streams of parchment bearing inked psalms. He rarely left that chamber unless something troubled him. Normally, he communicated through intermediaries, but now he dragged himself across the observation deck as if being too far from the growing psychic tide physically hurt him. I remember how the crew fell silent, the hum of the plasma drives seeming to quiet with them. Even those who didn't understand the navigator. Jeanline could sense the weight of his presence. His two mortal eyes were red-rimmed and strained, as though he hadn't blinked for hours. He told the captain that the tides were wrong, shifting too quickly, their patterns folding in on themselves like thoughts devouring thoughts. It wasn't enough to halt the journey. Imperial schedules never bent to comfort, but it was enough to thicken the tension in the corridors like fog. When the glory finally reached the translation point, we gathered in our assigned compartments. The translation alarms pulsed gently, bathing the walls in a dim crimson glow that throbbed like a heartbeat. Everyone clutched something, a charm, a data slate etched with a litany, a fragment of bone thought to bring luck. I pressed my hand against my chest, where a small coin hung beneath my uniform, engraved with the imperial aquila so worn it felt smooth to the touch. They told us these were symbols of protection. I never believed that. I carried it because it reminded me of Terra's light, distant and unreachable though it was. The moment the warp drives activated, I felt a pressure against my skull, as though invisible fingers pressed inward from every angle. Not painfully yet, but insistently, like the warp was trying to mold my mind into a shape it found more pleasing. The transition itself lasted less than a second in real space, but inside that moment, I felt stretched thin, like my consciousness had been pulled across a chasm that wanted to snap shut and trap me forever. A cold breath passed across the back of my neck, though no vent was open. Someone near me whimpered. Another muttered for the Emperor's protection, their voice trembling. A third knelt, clutching the deck, as if afraid gravity itself might abandon them. And then we were inside. The warp never appeared to us directly. We lacked the navigator's sight, but its presence settled around us like a heavy curtain, distorting everything. The lights flickered in, Unnatural rhythms, not in the stuttering way of malfunctioning circuits, but in pulses that seemed to follow a pattern too complex to decode. The air tasted different too, tinged with an undercurrent of sweetness that made my stomach twist. I remember breathing shallowly, trying not to inhale too deeply, as though the very atmosphere might steal something vital from me. Over the next hours, the ship grew quieter. Not because the engines faltered, they thundered ceaselessly, but because the crew stopped speaking. Words felt too fragile, too risky, like anything said aloud might attract the attention of something unseen. Even the servitors, bound to their endless tasks, seemed to move with an odd stiffness, their cogitators whirring at inconsistent tempos. Once, I passed one whose vox grill emitted a faint, rhythmic clicking. It sounded almost like whispering. I forced myself not to listen closely. In the lower decks, the shadows grew bolder. Some corners seemed deeper than they should be, light failing to penetrate their edges, no matter how close a lumen strip burned. Once, I saw a silhouette inside one of those shadows, shaped almost like a person standing perfectly still, facing away. But when I blinked, it melted back into the darkness, leaving nothing but my pounding heart and the faint sensation that something had stared at me without eyes. Captain Varin ordered increased patrols, though none of us wanted to walk the corridors alone. I served with Enforcer Hale then, a stern man who scoffed at superstition. But even he tightened his grip on his shock baton as we patrolled Section 9, where the bulkhead doors rattled intermittently, though no turbulence rocked the ship. The metal vibrated beneath our gloves, as if something pressed its weight against the other side. Hale knocked twice, the sound ringing hollow through the corridor. I wanted to ask why he had done that, what he expected to answer back, but the words froze in my throat. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Hale turned away first. The first real incident happened on the third day. A junior engine seer began screaming in the reactor bay. By the time we arrived, he was curled on the floor, clutching his temples, blood streaming from his nose. He babbled nonsense between gasped breaths, saying something was singing inside his skull, a voice without a mouth, humming a tune that promised to peel away his memories. The ship's Magos demanded calm, insisting it was a hallucination brought on by fatigue. He dragged the engine seer away for correction, and we never saw him again. The crew exchanged glances, unspoken fear passing between us like a contagion. The warp had begun to notice us. Each cycle felt longer than the one before it, time bending subtly, as if the ship existed outside the natural flow of hours. Sleep became uneasy. I dreamt of hallways that looped endlessly, of hands reaching from the walls, of a distant choir singing in tones my waking mind could not unravel. I woke with the taste of ash on my tongue. Others fared worse. Some wandered the corridors in half-conscious trances, some refused to leave their bunks, and some muttered that the walls were watching them breathe. But the worst moment, the one that still lingers with me, came during a ship-wide power fluctuation. The lumen arrays flickered into darkness for a heartbeat. In that instant, I felt the ship drift, not physically, but spiritually, like we had been pushed from a cliff we never realized we stood upon. I saw, or thought I saw, faint outlines moving through the darkness, shapes that slithered more than walked. The lights snapped back, blindingly bright, and the corridor was empty. But Hale, who stood beside me, stared into space as though he still saw them. He whispered, "They noticed the lights going out." After that, the crew avoided the unlit corners with almost religious devotion. Even the Mechanicus tech priests, who scoffed at mortal fear, began performing. Maintenance in pairs, their metallic voices laced with static that sounded like nervousness. Master Hestian grew more restless too. Reports flowed up the chain that he spent more time with his third eye open, staring into the roiling tides of the Imperium, despite the strain it placed on his mutated body. They said his skin grew pale, almost translucent, and the veins along his temple pulsed with psi static. He did not sleep, he did not eat, he simply watched the storm. The truth is that life aboard a void ship is always dangerous, but the warp has a way of stripping away the illusions of safety. It begins quietly, soft as a breath on the back of your neck, warm as the memory of a childhood lullaby. But beneath that gentleness, something hungers, something waits. Something learns your name, not the one others speak, but the one inside your mind, the one you whisper to yourself when you're afraid. And on the glory of Alecto, we all felt it learning. We were still days from real space. When the final herald came, the soft, almost tender sensation of being watched by something that had no eyes, no shape, no boundary. It pressed against the ship like a curiosity, like a predator testing the strength of a cage. The shadows shivered, the whispers grew bold, the dreams sharpened into knives. We would later learn that this was only the beginning. The warp does not show its true form all at once. It peels away your certainty layer by layer until you no longer remember what silence feels like, what calm tastes like, what the world looked like before the first shadow drifted across your path. And as we drifted deeper into the Imperium, the shadows finally began to move. The shadows did not simply move, they learned to breathe. It began with a subtle shift in their cadence, as though they inhaled when we exhaled, as though silence itself had gained lungs and waited for the right moment to fill them with our fear. I noticed it first while making my rounds near the auxiliary shrine, one of those cramped compartments where crewmen whispered their devotions in the hope that the Emperor's distant light might reach through thousands of light years of darkness. The lumen strips flickered, not in the erratic burst of a damaged power line, but in a slow, rhythmic pulse that mimicked the rise and fall of a chest. When the lights dimmed, the shadows lengthened, creeping up the walls like fingers reaching for warmth. When the lights brightened again, the shadows recoiled, as though burned. Enforcer Hale noticed it too. We didn't speak of it, not openly, but whenever the lights dimmed, his hand drifted instinctively toward the shock baton, clipped to his belt. That baton would do nothing against what lurked in the dark, but humans cling to whatever symbols of control they can. For Hale, that baton was a reminder of order, the idea that somewhere, beyond the warp's suffocating madness, the Imperium still existed as a place where rules and consequences mattered. For me, the coin at my neck served the same purpose, but each hour in the Imperium made those symbols feel thinner, like paint flaking off rusted metal. Strange occurrences multiplied. One morning cycle, a Vox operator named Ralvan froze mid-message, his eyes unfocused, his mouth hanging open. The static chatter of distant Imperial channels filled the room, distorted and warped as though someone or something was rearranging the frequencies with malicious delight. Then Ralvan began to speak, but the words were not his own. His voice deepened into a guttural rasp, syllables breaking like bones between each phrase. No one understood the language, if it could be called that. But the cadence was unmistakably deliberate. The tech priest overseeing the station slammed the emergency sigil, severing the Vox feed and shocking Ralvan back to consciousness. He collapsed, convulsing, his lips stained with blood he didn't remember biting from his own tongue. The tech priest insisted it was a seizure caused by radiation bleed. No one believed him. Soon after, Master Hestian summoned the captain and senior officers to a briefing in the observation sanctum. Word spread among the crew like a contagion. Something was wrong with the warp tides, more wrong than we were being told. Hestian's growing agitation seeped into every deck like oil through cloth. He had become the ship's barometer for psychic turbulence, and lately he stood on the precipice of panic. When Hale and I passed by the sanctum door on our patrol, we heard muffled voices escalating into strained argument. Captain Varin demanded answers. Hestian replied with language that barely seemed human. When the door finally slid open, the navigator emerged, his face ashen and slick with sweat. He leaned heavily on his staff, each step a struggle. But what unsettled me most was his third eye still sealed by layers of gold-wrought script yet pulsing, as though something inside it writhed like a caged animal. He didn't see us as he passed. Or perhaps he did see us, but through a lens that filtered mortal shapes into unrecognizable forms. "Something hunts the ship," he whispered, though no one had asked. "It follows the wake. It learns the scent of thought." He drifted onward before anyone could speak. Hale exhaled slowly, like a man who had been holding his breath for far too long. The hallway felt colder after Hestian left, the air sharp with the tang of ozone that accompanies psychic strain. The next incident occurred in the hydroponics bay, a place normally shielded from the harsher emotions of the crew. Plants do not fear the warp, they do not dream. But on that day, the entire bay descended into chaos. The nutrient pumps overloaded, spewing vaporized moisture in thick clouds that obscured sight. Amid the fog, the workers swore they saw silhouettes slipping between the growth racks, figures tall and thin, with limbs bending at impossible angles. When the emergency vents cleared the fog, nothing remained except overturned equipment and a lingering scent like rotting flowers. One worker refused to leave her station afterward. She insisted one of the shapes had whispered her name, not aloud, but inside her mind, spoken with intimate familiarity. The mechanicus blamed atmospheric imbalance, the workers blamed demons, and the captain blamed fear. But fear had long since ceased being a simple emotion aboard the glory of Electo. It had become a physical presence, coiling through the ship like a serpent, tightening its grip with every passing cycle. Sleep became a battlefield. I fought nightmares that echoed too closely to reality, hands stretching from the bulkheads, twisted faces pressing against the inside of the lumen strips, voices murmuring in languages that scraped against the inside of my skull. It was as if the warp no longer waited for dreams to seize us. It reached in, tearing the boundary between waking and sleeping like wet parchment. Some crewmen refused to sleep entirely, wandering the corridors with hollow eyes, muttering prayers under their breath. Others slept deeply but woke with no memories of closing their eyes, their minds blank and fragile, as though something had reached inside and scraped away the edges of their identity. A few never woke at all. Their bodies remained untouched, their expressions frozen in serene calm, as if they had slipped quietly into some unseen embrace. We called them the claimed. The mechanicus removed them without ceremony, their bodies wheeled away by servitors with unblinking augmetic eyes. But even after the corpses vanished into the lower decks, the scent of cold incense lingered, as though the air itself mourned them. Hale tried to maintain order, gathering groups of rattled crewmen and delivering terse reassurances he didn't believe. He repeated phrases from the Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer protocols, drilled into every enforcer, soldier, and officer, meant to quell panic. But the warp does not respect rehearsed speeches, and Hale's voice trembled more each day. One cycle, during a patrol near the ammunition vaults, Hale suddenly stopped walking, his gaze fixed on a point above my shoulder. I turned slowly, knowing before I looked that nothing good waited behind me. The hallway was empty, but Hale stared as though something towered over us, something tall enough to brush the ceiling, something only he could see. "It's watching us," he whispered. His fear seeped into me like cold water soaking through cloth. I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. His muscles were rigid, his breath shallow, his eyes wide. Whatever he saw, or thought he saw, vanished when the lumen strips flickered. He blinked rapidly, then cursed under his breath, rubbing his face with trembling fingers. We walked in silence after that. The crew's emotional fractures deepened. Rumors spread that the ship was drifting off the stable warp lanes, pulled towards some unseen vortex. Others whispered that a warp entity had marked us, that our Geller field was weakening, thinning like a frayed veil. Those were the same whispers the Imperial Navy forbade, the kind that ended in disciplinary confinement or worse, but fear loosens tongues quicker than truth. Master Hestian retreated deeper into his sanctum, emerging only once more that cycle. I was present when he did. The deck shook with a sudden violent lurch that threw crewmen to their knees. A deafening shriek reverberated through the walls, metal protesting against a pressure it wasn't meant to endure. The lights dimmed to a sickly amber. The sanctum doors snapped open and Hestian staggered out, clutching his head. A faint glow pulsed beneath the golden lattice, sealing his third eye, seeping through the gaps like embers, forcing their way through cracks in stone. "The tides have turned," he gasped. "We drift toward the moor." Captain Varen demanded clarity. What was the moor? Was it a warp storm? A demonic domain? A psychic manifestation? Hestian only shook his head, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "It is hunger," he said. "A place where thought decays, where souls unravel." His staff clattered to the ground as he collapsed. Blood leaked from the corner of his sealed third eye. The apothecaries carried him away. None of us saw him after that. Without the navigator's guidance, The ship's course became increasingly unstable. The Geller field flickered intermittently, creating shimmers in the air that made the walls seem elastic, bending inward with ominous intent before snapping back into place. During one flicker, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the hall, tall, slender, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an inquisitive angle. When the field stabilized, it vanished. That was when I realized the truth. The warp no longer pressed against the ship from the outside. It had begun to seep in. Not fully, not enough to breach the hull in the catastrophic way we had all heard whispered tales about, but enough to erode the boundary between our world and that roiling sea of nightmares. Enough to let shapes slip through the cracks, faint impressions of beings not yet fully formed, like sketches brought to life by a fevered hand. The crew grew desperate. Arguments broke out. Fistfights erupted in the mess hall. One man tried to pry open an airlock, screaming that he could hear the Emperor calling him from outside the hull. Another barricaded himself in his quarters and carved symbols into the walls, claiming they protected him from the voices whispering through the ventilation system. Nothing protected any of us. Hale, once a pillar of discipline, began to falter. He talked less, slept less, and reacted slowly during his shifts. His gaze often drifted to the corners of the room, where the shadows pooled unnaturally. Sometimes he muttered responses to questions no one had asked aloud. More than once, I caught him tracing the outline of a symbol on his palm, a jagged shape he had carved into the skin with a piece of scrap metal. When I confronted him, he insisted it kept the whispers at bay. He believed it. That terrified me more than the symbol itself. The truth is this: the warp does not break a ship in one strike. It wears down the mind, weakens the spirit, and waits. It knows that fear is the finest chisel, doubt the sharpest knife. On the glory of Alecto, we had begun to fray. And as the Geller field faltered once more, plunging the ship into a stuttering twilight, I realized something with cold certainty. The warp wasn't hunting us. It was already inside, searching for a way to make us part of its endless, shifting landscape. And it had only just begun. The first sensation was motion without direction, the ghostly lurch of a body falling while perfectly still. It felt as though the floor had vanished beneath my boots, though when I looked down, the deck plating remained intact, faintly humming with residual energy. The others in my squad froze, caught between instinct and dread, their expressions reflecting the same unspoken truth I felt threading through my bones. The warp was moving, and it did not need our permission. A faint tremor rippled across the air, the kind of vibration that doesn't so much shake metal as it stirs the marrow of whatever living being stands upon it. It reminded me of the shudder a hunting beast makes when exhaling against the leaves of a forest before it pounces. And in that moment, as reality tugged itself thin as parchment around us, I understood that nothing about this place truly hunted. Hunting implies intent. This was hunger in its absolute form, pure and blind, seeking sustenance in shapes we could scarcely comprehend. A low groan rose from the metal bulkheads, like the sound of a vast ocean withdrawing from a rocky cliff, accompanied by a flicker in the lumen strips overhead. The lights dimmed, then glared back so harshly that several of us shielded our eyes. I could taste iron on my tongue, as if the ship itself had bled into the air. Then, the Vox grills crackled with a noise that was not static. It was something too deliberate for that. A wet, mucus scrape like something dragging itself across the inside of the transmission line. Every nerve in my body tightened. Behind us, a young trooper whispered the beginning of the litany of stability, voice trembling, syllables stumbling. But even his prayer felt thin here, stretched and diluted like ink in a sea of madness. Whatever listened in the dark didn't fear our small rights. When the deck bucked again, no one fell, though it felt as though we should have. It was gravity without rules, weight without direction. Some instinct forced me to grip my rifle tighter, though I doubted it would matter. The warp does not care for bullets. It devours concepts before flesh. I felt the thought unspool inside me, an idea that wasn't mine. Something whispered that I was already dissolving, that my memories were soft and unstable, that every step I had ever taken in my life could be plucked from the timeline like threads from a rotted tapestry. I shook my head hard, trying to force the idea out, but it felt slick, sticky, clinging to my consciousness like a parasite, refusing to dislodge. The sirens began moments later, but not the ones we were trained to recognize. These were deeper, colder, rising like a choir of metal lungs forced to fill with icy vapor. The pitch wavered, bending in ways sound should not bend. Some tones seemed too low for hearing yet rattled the ribs. Others felt too high yet somehow made the teeth ache. These were warning signals the ship did not possess. These were sounds invented by the warp, mimicking order just enough to cause panic. We all felt it, every visor turning toward every corridor, every finger tightening near a trigger, every breath shortening into sharp, clipped cycles. When the hallway stretched, we saw it. One heartbeat, the corridor was a standard length, lit with sterile white lumens. The next heartbeat, it extended outward like molten wax, stretching, elongating, distorting. The vanishing point pulled away from us. Walls rippled as though made of viscous liquid rather than metal. The lumen strips flickered faster, each flash bending the perspective subtly. One moment, the corridor seemed a cathedral vault, with its ceiling soaring beyond reach. The next, it narrowed into a cramped pipe, barely large enough for a human to crawl through. It didn't move with natural rhythm. It convulsed, like a wounded thing. The ship was trying to maintain its form, and the warp was trying to convince it that form was optional. One of my squadmates, Corporal Vale, took a single step backward. His boot touched the deck, but the sound it produced was wrong, a soft, wet impression instead of a hard, metallic tap. His eyes widened in terror. When he lifted his foot, there was a smear where his boot had been. Not blood, not oil, something more like the residue left by a slug dragged across stone. And yet, his boot was clean, his leg was clean. It was the deck that wasn't right. The ship was rewriting itself beneath us, its matter struggling to remember the shape it once possessed. A scream finally tore free, but not from Vale. It echoed from somewhere far down the shifting corridor, hollow and distorted by the contorting architecture. It sounded like a person screaming inside a funnel, the voice stretched, bent, folded into itself. It might not have been human at all. As it faded, another sound followed, a wet clicking, rhythmic and soft, like claws tapping inside the walls. But claws implies an animal, and animals imply nature. Nothing in the warp obeys. Natural law. A faint shadow darted across the far end of the corridor, not a shape we could describe, not a silhouette that made sense. It was like watching a reflection break free of its mirror. The moment it appeared, several of us raised our rifles, though no orders had been given. Every instinct screamed that we should fire, that if we didn't, something would slip closer. But firing in the warp is like shouting commands at the tide, futile, sometimes dangerous. The clicking intensified. The lights snapped to crimson, and suddenly the corridor didn't stretch anymore. It snapped back to its original form so violently that it made the air crackle, as though reality had slapped itself awake. The sudden compression sent a shockwave of pressure through us. Our ears popped. One trooper vomited into his rebreather. The lights stabilized, the walls stopped rippling. The deck felt solid again beneath our feet, but the clicking did not stop. Instead, it crept closer. We began to fall, into formation, trying to anchor ourselves with ritualized discipline. Even that felt brittle, as though the chain of command itself was a fragile idea here. Sergeant Hesk's voice barked orders, though part of me wondered whether the warp would swallow his words before they reached our ears. We aimed our rifles, surrounded by red light and metal that had suddenly remembered how to be metal. For the first time since the distortion began, the ship felt unmoving again, like it had momentarily escaped the warp's playful torment. Then the thing appeared. It did not crawl from the shadows. It did not emerge with theatrical violence. It simply was, stepping into being as though reality had forgotten to forbid it. A human shape, or close enough. A man in a tattered void suit, his helmet cracked open, visor shattered, pale skin, veins darkened like branching ink. He stumbled toward us, arms limp at his sides, head tilted as if listening to a distant sound. His mouth hung slightly open. When he breathed, the sound was wet and gurgling. But it wasn't the man that froze us. It was the fact that his legs ended at the knees. There was nothing below. And yet he moved, walking on the idea of feet rather than actual limbs, each imagined step tapping faintly on the deck, as though reality humored his delusion. Someone whispered, "Warp Revenant." Someone else whispered a prayer. I said nothing. My throat had closed around the words before they could form. The figure stopped only a few meters from us. His head rolled lazily to one side, cracking like old leather. His eyes, once human, had become matte black voids, holes that didn't reflect light, didn't glimmer, didn't blink. They absorbed everything. They stared at us, though I do not believe they saw us. I think they saw something looking through us, something using those sockets as a window. When his jaw moved, dust spilled from the cracks in his skin. His mouth opened too wide. His voice was two voices layered, one, human, and one, not, "Help, me." The second voice echoed after the first as though mocking it. I felt my grip falter. The man was dead. There was no question. His soul had either fled or been devoured long ago. What looked at us wasn't a request for aid, it was bait. Draped in the familiar shape of a victim, the warp knows how to weaponize pity. Every instinct screamed that if we stepped closer, we would suffer a fate even worse than his. Sergeant Hesk fired first. The bolt round struck the Revenant's chest. For a moment it reacted like any corpse might, jerking backward, tearing open, spilling viscous fluid. But then, it simply lost cohesion. The entire figure dissolved into a smear of shadow and dust, collapsing like wet ash, slipping through the deck plating as though it had never existed at all. The clicking sound vanished with it. The lights flickered once more, and then the whispering began. It didn't come from the corridor, or the vents, or the Revenant's remains. It came from inside our helmets. A chorus of thin, brittle voices, layered upon one another like overlapping shards of glass. They were too faint to make out individually, yet collectively they formed a melody that made my mind itch. Not a warning, not a threat, something worse. They whispered knowledge. They whispered our names. Each name was pronounced with perfect clarity, spoken in a tone that mimicked the voices of loved ones long dead. The warp does not need to guess. It plucks memories as easily as a finger brushing dust from a shelf. My mother's voice echoed inside my helmet, though she'd died 30 years before on a world whose name I rarely spoke aloud. Hearing her voice again should have soothed me. Instead, it felt like a bone-white hand reaching inside my skull to tug at something delicate. Others were not so controlled. Trooper Lena tore off his helmet, screaming at the voice that followed him even without the vox. He clawed at his ears, his pupils dilated, until his eyes were nearly black. I reached out to restrain him, but he convulsed violently, muscles snapping tight as though electrified. His scream rose into a pitch no human should achieve. Then he went silent, collapsing forward. His body melted, not literally, but structurally, as though all tension had been vacuumed out of him. He lay limp, breathing, but gone. A hollow shell the warp had drained like a wineskin. We dragged him aside. Hesk didn't order us to leave him behind. He didn't need to. The warp itself had decided Lena's fate. There was no returning from what had hollowed him. The whispers faded only after we activated our helmet seals and recited the rite of binding together, speaking in unison, forcing our minds into a singular rhythm. I do not know if it worked or if the warp simply lost interest, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the voices had. We pressed on. The corridor no longer stretched, the walls no longer melted, the lights no longer flickered. Instead, everything became unnaturally perfect. The hallways were symmetrical, lumen strips evenly spaced, bulkheads aligned. Two aligned. Every bolt was precisely identical, every scuff mark repeated at the same intervals. The ship had overcorrected, swinging from chaos into a mathematical precision no human hand could achieve. It was as though the warp was trying to imitate reality and had chosen perfection as its template, unaware that perfection itself is unnatural. We walked in that sterile stillness for what felt like hours or seconds. Time in the warp isn't a river, it's a shattered mirror. Each shard reflects a different moment. You step from one shard to the next, never knowing if you are moving forward or sideways, or into a memory that never belonged to you. Eventually, the corridor ended. A door waited there, a simple blast door marked with the ship's insignia. Behind it, lay the next chamber of our patrol route, but none of us trusted it. It looked too normal, too untouched, as though the warp had placed it there deliberately, waiting to see if we would try to open it, like children approaching a box they had been told not to touch. Still, orders were orders. Sergeant Hesk keyed the door. It hissed open, and I understood then, in the quiet moment before the lights revealed what waited inside, that the warp had not shown us horrors. Not yet. It had merely cleared its throat. As the chamber beyond flickered into view, its contents waiting like teeth behind a smile, I realized we had only taken our first true step into madness. The descent had only begun. The chamber beyond the blast door should have been familiar. According to the ship's schematics, it was a junction hub, a dull, functional space used by crew to cross between maintenance spines. I had walked through it 100 times during routine drills. But the warp has no respect for routine. It does not honor memory. It gnaws at the map of your mind and redraws it according to whatever grotesque geometry it finds amusing in that moment. So when the door fully irised open, we faced something that only vaguely recalled its former purpose, the way a fever dream recalls waking life, distorted, exaggerated, vibrating with contradictions. The room stretched in a way that made depth uncertain. The ceiling rose higher than the ship's deck plans allowed, vanishing into a gloom that pulsed like breathing fabric. The lumen strips overhead flickered in a slow, rhythmic stutter, casting long shadows that bent unnaturally, as though every object in the room had a second shape lying beneath its visible form. The air tasted stale and metallic, like the inside of an ancient iron coffin. A faint static hum lingered at the edge of hearing, the aftertaste of psychic residue clinging to the walls. We entered cautiously, boots clicking against the deck with a sound that seemed just a fraction delayed, overlapping itself like an echo that hadn't been given permission to behave correctly. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look too long at anything in my periphery. The warp preys on curiosity. What you see is never as dangerous as what you think you saw. Hesk raised his hand, signaling us to fan out. His movements were stiff but controlled, the way a man behaves when discipline is the only thing keeping him from losing the last threads of sanity. We followed him into the chamber, rifles at the ready, navigating around piles of machinery that no longer served identifiable functions. Some hunks of metal resembled the remains of cogitators, others melted halfway into the peen deck, as though the ship had attempted to reabsorb them. It all smelled faintly of burned promethium, though no flames had touched the room. A low groan echoed from somewhere overhead. It was not the groan of metal under stress, nor the sound of engines shifting power. It was a bodily sound, wet and intimate, like a throat struggling to swallow something too large. Every head snapped up instinctively. The ceiling seemed to bend in response to our attention, its surface rippling in slow waves like the surface of a disturbed lake. Something moved behind it, massive, amorphous, pressing down so that the metal bulged outward before retreating again into obscurity. Vale whispered, "Is the ceiling alive?" Hesk shut him up with a glare so sharp it could have cut through plasteel. Even so, the question hung in the air like a rancid scent, impossible to ignore. I didn't answer aloud, but inside my helmet, my breath grew shallow. That ceiling, whatever inhabited it, had reacted to our presence like sensitive skin touched by fingertips. The warp was no longer twisting the ship abstractly. It was wearing the ship like flesh. When the groaning ceased, a different sound emerged, rising from the far corner of the chamber. A soft, repeated tapping, irregular but unmistakably deliberate. The kind of sound that made you think of someone trapped behind a wall, gently knocking, hoping to be let out. Every instinct in my body told me to ignore it, but instinct means little inside the warp. The sound grew more insistent, a little faster, as though whoever or whatever was tapping sensed our hesitation. We edged closer. The source was a section of wall plating near an auxiliary conduit. The metal bulged outward slightly, dented from inside. Something struck it again, softly. Tap, tap, tap. Vale stepped forward, raising his rifle. The dent pulsed once, as if reacting to Vale's proximity. Then it split. It didn't crack open like metal usually does. It parted like brittle skin, peeling back in jagged strips as a pale hand forced its way through. Fingers too long, too thin, scrabbled blindly at the air. their joints bending with soft, nauseating clicks. The nails were black with dried blood. The hand groped outward, frantic. Another hand followed, then an arm. A human head pushed through the gap, forehead scraping against torn metal. Skin sloughed off in places, hanging like wet parchment. The eyes were wide and unseeing. The mouth formed silent syllables, chewing on nothing. It was a crewman, or rather, it had once been. We stumbled back, horror prickling across our skin like static electricity. The creature dragged itself through the hole with jerking, convulsive motions. More of its body followed, not intact, not coherent, but reassembled wrong, elongated, twisted, bones visible where flesh had dissolved, organs pulsing exposed beneath skeletal clamps of half-dissolved ribs. It collapsed onto the deck with a spongy slap, limbs twitching. Then it tried to stand. Muscles stretched like taffy, ligaments twanged and snapped. The head lolled sideways, connected only by a few sinews. Yet still the creature pushed itself upright, driven by some tormenting instinct to move, to live, or perhaps living wasn't the point. Perhaps suffering was the only currency the warp required from this wretched thing. Lenne's empty shell had been dreadful. This was worse. This was physical proof that the warp didn't merely break minds. It broke bodies, too, twisting them until they were no longer vessels of flesh, but expressions of torment. Every motion the creature made produced a soft, wet, tearing sound. I could hear the hissing of air as it escaped through holes in its chest, whistling like a broken flute. Hesk ordered us to fire. We didn't hesitate. Bolt rounds tore through the thing, exploding chunks of warped tissue across the walls. It convulsed violently, shrieking without a voice. A psychic wail rippled through the chamber, a raw blast of anguish so intense that several of us staggered. But finally, mercifully, the creature collapsed in on itself, its body collapsing like a burst wineskin. The metal around the tear sealed itself slowly, as though ashamed of having birthed something so foul. I did not trust the wall any more than before. Before we could regroup, the ceiling groaned again. But this time, it spoke. Not in any human tongue, not in demonic language. It spoke in the sound of ruptured bone. It spoke in the hiss of blistered flesh peeling from iron. It spoke in the rumbling undertone of a ship trying not to scream. The entire chamber vibrated with its voice, its meaning impossible to grasp yet perfectly understood on some primitive, ancient level. The ceiling wanted us to listen. The lights dimmed to near darkness, and then the shadows moved. They slid across the walls with slow, sinuous progress, joining, splitting, merging like pools of oil beneath flickering lumens. They stretched into filled, elongated forms that walked without feet, crawling without limbs. They surrounded us, not close enough to touch, but close enough that we could feel the cold pressure of their presence graze our armor. Vale began muttering prayers under his breath. Trask's hands shook so violently his rifle clattered against his breastplate. I could feel my own pulse thundering against my skull. One shadow drifted in front of me. As I stared into its shapeless mass, something inside it flickered like glowing embers stirring beneath ashes. A face, a half-face. The face of someone long dead, someone whose loss I had tried for years to forget. My brother, his eyes hollow, his mouth mouthing a word that broke me. Run, but running was impossible. The shadows were not simply illusions. They were the warp's breath, flowing through the cracks of our minds. Looking away felt like trying to pull free of quicksand. Every second felt like drowning. Hesk's voice snapped over the squad channel, distorted by fear but still iron hard. Move, now. And somehow, against instinct, against memory, against the shadows whispering to us, we moved. We maneuvered toward the opposite side of the chamber, rifles raised, boots clanging against the deck. The shadows hissed as we passed, reaching out with tendrils of darkness that brushed our armor. The temperature dropped sharply, numbing my fingertips even through my gauntlets. Each breath I took felt like inhaling smoke and ice simultaneously. The door ahead was partially open. A sliver of normal lumen light spilled through it, too clean, too steady to belong to this corrupted chamber. It felt like a promise, or bait. The warp often made no distinction between the two. As we neared the exit, the ceiling convulsed one final time. Something inside it pushed downward. bulging grotesquely, as though the entire mass of the warp creature sought to force its way through the thin membrane of metal. The lights above us burst in a shower of sparks. The shadows screamed in silence, and beneath the ceiling's skin, I saw only for a moment an eye staring down at us, vast, unblinking, filled with an intelligence so alien it made my mind recoil. It was not watching us, it was studying us. Sergeant Hesk shoved us through the door, slamming the control panel. The blast door sealed with a deafening clang, cutting off the chamber and the thing that lived above it. The corridor we entered was stark, quiet, undistorted. Its lights were steady, its walls were straight. It looked untouched by the warp, but none of us believed it. We stood in tense silence, breaths ragged, minds reeling. The warp had shown us cruelty before. What we had just witnessed was its artistry. And deep within that quiet corridor, with the memory of the eye still burned into my thoughts, I realized something chilling. The warp wasn't simply tormenting us, it was preparing us for what waited deeper within. And though none of us spoke it aloud, we all knew the worst was yet to come. The corridor beyond the nightmare chamber felt like stepping into a memory that no longer fit the mind that remembered it. Everything was too still, too precise, too clean. The lumen strips shone with a clarity that felt artificial, like the ship was imitating stability rather than possessing it. Every footfall echoed as though the metal beneath us had grown hollow. The air carried no scent, not even the faint oil and ozone tang that normally marked Imperial corridors. It was the absence of sensation that unsettled me most. The warp didn't always reveal its claws, sometimes it unraveled reality by subtraction. We moved in a tight formation, rifles raised but no longer steady. Each of us felt stretched thin, spirits pulled taut by everything we had witnessed. No one spoke. There was nothing useful left to say. All that remained was the grim, shared certainty that whatever lay ahead would not grant us even the illusion of mercy. The warp's presence, even when invisible, pressed against us in a way that made the corridor feel narrower with each step. Some instinct whispered that we were walking not through a passage of metal, but down the throat of some unseen beast. I tried to focus on breathing. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Keep the mind locked, sealed, fortified. But every exhale came with a faint tremor. Every inhale felt too cold. We came to an intersection. 3 hallways branched away, one left, one right, one continuing forward. According to the ship's layout, they should have led to different maintenance decks. But the signs were blank, stripped of all text. Not scraped off, not burned away, simply gone, as though no alphabet had ever existed. The metal plates were smooth to the touch, yet something beneath them vibrated faintly, like restless breath trying to find a voice. Hesk motioned for us to hold. He approached the left passage first, leaning just enough to glance inside without crossing the threshold. A second later he jerked back, jaw tight. I caught only a glimpse of what lay beyond. Endless darkness, impossibly deep for a ship corridor, with faint specks of dim red light drifting like embers suspended in water. The air around that passage felt warmer, like a breath against the face. Hesk then checked the right passage. This time, a low, static hum crawled through the air, brushing against our skulls like tiny fingers. Inside, the floor sloped subtly downward, though the deck plans listed it as level. At the far end, barely visible, a shape hovered a few centimeters above the floor, motionless, cloaked in shadow, almost human but somehow too slender, too tall. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening to the soft clicking of our boots. We backed away before it moved. Forward was all that remained. The corridor ahead bent sharply after a few meters, turning into a winding path that should not have existed within the rigid structure of an Imperial vessel. The ship was designed with precision straight lines, predictable angles. But this path curled like a spine torn from some creature of the warp and grafted onto our deck. The walls bowed slightly inward, meeting overhead in an arch that made me feel like a supplicant entering a chapel. Except this was no Imperial chapel. As we advanced, inscriptions began to appear along the walls, carved directly into the metal. They weren't demonic runes or Xenos symbols. They were Imperial Gothic characters, etched with exacting precision, but the words themselves made no sense. Phrases like, "The moment becomes blood," and "You are the memory that suffers and step closer to your own forgotten throat." The sentences felt like remnants of broken dreams, fragments of thought extracted from dying minds and pressed into the ship's skin like confessions. Vale began to tremble. "Stop reading the walls," Hesk muttered, voice low. "Ignore everything that isn't real." But that was the problem. The warp made the distinction between real and unreal a game of chance. You never truly knew which side you had wagered on until you lost. We kept moving. After a minute or an hour, or a heartbeat, the corridor widened into a circular chamber. I recognized the architecture despite its corruption. This had once been a psychic shielding nexus, where a navigator's astral isolation conduits were maintained. The chamber was meant to stabilize the minds of those who walked its perimeter. Now, it amplified our fear. At the center of the room stood a pillar of warped metal and glass, once a conduit pillar, now fused into an obscene sculpture by the warp's influence. It twisted upward in an impossible spiral, glowing faintly along its edges. Something inside the pillar pulsed, like a faint heartbeat. The glow waxed and waned with hypnotic regularity, each pulse accompanied by a soft chime that resonated inside the skull more than in the ears. Trask clutched his helmet on both sides. "Stop that sound! Emperor save!" Hesk grabbed him by the wrist, steadying him before panic could take hold. We formed a tight circle around the pillar, instinctively facing outward, as though expecting something to approach from the walls. But nothing moved. No shadows stretched. No malformed hands split the plating. Instead, the warp chose a more insidious approach. The chamber grew warmer, then colder, then warmer again. A wave of emotion hit us, raw, primal terror that didn't belong to any of us. It seeped into the air like vapor, burrowing into the mind with claws made of memory. A vision struck me behind the eyes. I stood on Terra as the sky burned, golden light collapsing into endless night, the Astronomicon flickering like a candle in a storm. But I had never been to Terra. The vision wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. It was the warp borrowing the language of nightmares to make itself understood. Vale dropped to one knee. "I can't," he choked. "It knows us. It knows our thoughts." Of course it did. The warp was made of thought. We were walking through an ocean that was aware of every ripple of fear we produced. Hesk forced Vale back to his feet. "We move. Forward. Now." There was only one exit on the opposite side of the chamber, an arched doorway, framed by metal that looked scorched rather than melted, as though something unimaginably hot had passed through it long ago. A faint draft blew from it, carrying a smell not unlike burnt hair mixed with the sweetness of rotting fruit. The scent hit us hard, nauseating in its complexity, and my stomach tightened in revolt. As we passed through the archway, the floor beneath us changed texture. No longer smooth metal, rough, uneven, pitted. It took me a moment to realize what it resembled. Bone. Not the clean white of medical ossuaries, but old bone, porous, yellowed, cracked. The floor didn't shift or move beneath our weight, yet the sensation of walking on it made my skin crawl. The corridor ahead sloped downward, illuminated only by faint red lights that pulsed in rhythm with the pillar's heartbeat from the previous room. Each pulse seemed louder than the last. We descended in silence until a faint rustling noise drifted from below. It sounded like parchment scraping against stone, then a whisper, then many whispers, overlapping in disjointed harmony. Words emerged from the chorus, not in Gothic, not in anything spoken by living tongues, but familiar anyway, like a memory of a nightmare half forgotten. We rounded the final bend, and the corridor opened into a void. Not a room, not truly. It expanded beyond the ship's structure, replacing walls and ceiling with a vast darkness speckled by faint, drifting motes of light, like stars drowning in ink. The floor, still bone-like, extended into the abyss as a narrow bridge, suspended over nothing. The bridge was wide enough for a single person to walk comfortably, but no more. Something stirred beneath the bridge. Shapes slithered in the dark, massive, unseen bodies whose presence was marked only by the sound of shifting weight and the faint glimmer of movement far below. I could not tell whether they were crawling along invisible surfaces or floating in the void. The bridge trembled slightly, as though something below had brushed against it. We froze. The whispers grew louder, and then the void ahead lit with a faint, sickly glow. A figure stood at the far end of the bridge. At first, I thought it was human. It had a human silhouette, human height, human posture. But as the glow intensified, the truth emerged through the distortion. The figure's body flickered like a reflection in shattered glass. Every few seconds, its shape elongated, then snapped back. Its head would tilt at an impossible angle, then return to center. Its arms stretched, then retracted. The warp was unable or unwilling to decide what form it should take. When it spoke, the voice arrived from everywhere. "You are close," the whisper threaded through my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. My vision dimmed around the edges. My breath caught in my throat. Hesk raised his rifle, but the figure only laughed a sound that made the bridge shudder as though recoiling. "You still carry hope," the voice said. "Hope is a wound. Let me clean it." The figure took a step toward us. The bridge cracked beneath its foot. Hesk fired. The bolt round traveled only a few meters before dissolving into mist. The figure did not react. It continued forward, its shape flickering with every movement. Something deep within the void stirred at the sound, something large enough to shift the air itself. Cold wind rose around us, carrying the distant sound of metal dragging across stone. Hesk didn't need to give the order. We opened fire, the corridor echoing with the roar of our rifles. The figure flickered violently, its form stuttering as though caught between layers of reality. For a moment, it seemed to split three silhouettes, stepping out of one. Then the shapes rejoined, melting into a single unstable outline. When the last bolt round fired, the figure finally staggered and fell. Its body dissolved before it hit the bridge, scattering like ash into the void. The whispers faded, but the void remained. Behind me, Vale whispered a single word. "Now what?" Before anyone could answer, the bridge lurched violently. The slithering shapes below rose toward the surface, drawn by the disturbance like predators sensing blood in water. Hesk barked a command to move, and we sprinted across the last stretch of the bone-like path. We reached the far end just as a massive tendril of darkness erupted from the abyss, shattering the bridge where we had stood seconds earlier. The corridor ahead sealed behind us with a grinding groan of metal plates, cutting off the void. For a long moment, we simply stood there, breathless, hearts pounding. We had escaped the abyss, but not the warp, because the warp does not let go, not truly, not ever. And as the lights flickered in the corridor ahead and the ship groaned with a sound like something waking from a dream of hunger, I realized the truth the warp had been whispering all along. Hell wasn't a place. Hell was a direction, and we were still walking toward it.